I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is actually the traditional territory of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, and Miami nations covered by sessions 98 and 99. Today it is home to a diverse population of other peoples, and I respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the West Lafayette and Purdue communities. So, central to any museum is its collection, the objects of history and art that it acquires, stores, displays, and preserves for the public trust. The possession of an exotic object offers an imagined access to a world of difference, often constituted as an enhancement of the new owner's knowledge, power, or wealth. Depending on the circumstances of that acquisition, such objects may invoke curiosity, awe, fear, admiration, contempt, or a combination of these responses. As such, museums have played an important role in shaping the contours of Western interactions between human and perceived non-human actors. As an art historian, I spend a likely inordinate amount of time in museums in my new home city of Montreal. As an anthropologist, however, my attention is often split between walking the galleries, between the works themselves, and watching how other visitors interact with the collections on display. Or, as I will be talking about in this paper, how they don't. This paper exposes how the space and presentation of art objects, the non-human, in museums has created several tangible and intangible barriers which shape the way visitors, the human, not only interact with these works, but also how we position them within our world. Artifacts are seen as passive subjects, precipitations of history, and through them, the societies that made them are nothing more than spectres of the past. Yet, just because it is not human does not mean it is incapable of agency. These collections are alive, and it's not enough to give these objects space in which to speak if their ability to be heard is limited by the visitor's own ability to understand what is being said. Yes. So, everything about the White Cube Gallery emanates this sterile dysconnectivity. Gallery halls can be stiflingly quiet save for the whispers of the ventilation systems, echoes of footsteps. And from the sharp-cornered plinths to the boundary wire to the cold glass cases separating us from the very things we came to experience. In the dense silence of the gallery, these cues scream at us to keep our distance. We cannot engage. And the layout teaches us that these objects are only meant to be looked at. So agency is the capacity of individuals to act independently and to make their own free choices. However, when I'm saying that art is an agent, as it can't fulfill that definition succinctly, I mean that art is an active player in the shaping of cultures and the humans within said culture. It tells us what to think, what to feel. It informs how we see, just as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis defends that language informs what we think. It acts upon us just as we act upon it in this endless feedback loop. So by presenting objects as animate, as agents, it opens up more ways to engage with collections beyond sight and touch. This includes critical analysis, discussion, storytelling, even replication, all of which not only draw the viewer into interacting with the object, but also address the ability of the object to act with them. So, I think something got split. Oh, no, okay. So the museum's authority comes from its control over artifacts, and by extension, the information encoded within the object that is used to create meaning. Any gallery is a carefully constructed room designed to convey a specific message, conceived and mediated by a curator. So let's think for a moment about how we separate art, artifact, and object when talking about museum collections. I personally tend to bounce between these without distinction, which can often be offense to a lot of old white men obsessed with Renaissance altarpieces. The object itself does not change, but the context does, and that allows the museum to define how visitors assign value to the collections and how we use them. When we think about it, we wouldn't treat art the same way we would think to treat an artifact, even though those would technically be the same object. So, for instance, in Montreal, the Musée des Beaux-Arts is a literal museum of fine arts, and it privileges the visual qualities of individual objects, while the exhibitions at Pointe-à-Carrière prioritizes the historical environment like other natural history museums. Both paradigms of presentation have pitfalls that need to be exposed in order to find the means to rectify these. So in many museums, works of ancient and modern art alike are presented against a blank background and isolated from context that inspired their creation. This teaches us that an artifact can be understood wholly in and of itself, that it can exist within a contextual vacuum. That is to say, that the visitor is guided to associate art's function as equivalent to its aesthetic values. We look only at the surface, instead of looking at everything that came to bring it to be. But as Carrier puts it, no form of art wears its meaning entirely on its face, end quote. Visual culture was embedded within daily life, not separated from it as we think in contemporary times. And it has always been this way. Name a society and I will show you the paint on its walls. So looking only at aesthetic features of an object, which itself is also very subjective, only reiterates the division between art and artifact, West and non-West. It creates a hierarchical comparison without the support of reflexivity or relativity. So we end up with these two modes of display. Collections presented as archaeological or ethnographic in the case of still living populations attempt to recreate context in which they were divided. The typical gallery is given an abundance of introductory text and supplemental environment. The materiality of the object is emphasized, either through descriptive labels or through carefully focused lights. Masks are set side by side with grayscale photographs of similar artifacts being used. But presenting collections in this way encourages the visitor to connect the object's value with its function and then to its maker. They are tools, passive products of a culture alien to our own. The visitor cannot see beyond the hands that made the object. And this very category of the ethnographic or the archaeological museum is dedicated to what we now term as the others, intended here as non-Western civilizations, societies or ethnic groups that need to be thought through. But I'm going to try and pull away there because we're getting into colonialism and I could seriously go on about that all day. But for now, we just need to recognize that this display of one culture by another is an expression of power. So present paradigms are essentially stuck in the idea that art and artifact are mutually exclusive classifications. The ultimatum is founded upon the colonizing gaze that places artifact as something inadequate in comparison to art, which does not account for indigenous understandings of these objects or how art actually functions in our lives, and attempts to reconcile non-Western art objects as art have primarily consisted of trying to retrofit them within established canon of classification. Creating the proper context for collection requires not just a shift in methodology, but a recognition of the inadequacy of Western art historical theories. The problem isn't the object, it's the system. And the divisions in how these collections are presented within the gallery underscores how the museum teaches this to the visitor. Building off of the acknowledgement of art's agency, reinserting cultural context in the gallery addresses the fact that art has never been for its own sake, and therefore cannot be understood without embedding it within a larger network of meaning. Culture is not easily compartmentalized, nor is it possible to completely isolate art from its circumstance without completely obliterating the framework that supplies it with meaning and function. So there's this notion that museums are the mausoleums of history. It's where the dead are cataloged, preserved, stored behind glass. But culture's not static, it's fluid. And the very purpose of culture is, in fact, to adapt to the environments and stresses, including mingling and adoption of internal and external influences. By drawing these lines between time periods and ethnic groups, teaches the idea that living cultures can be represented in collections that remain unchanged. And furthermore, this concept that time is a linear progression is based upon Eurocentric paradigms of civilization, where history is a one-way street, and those who are a part of the orderly procession of events remain there if they don't move forward. In the museum, when this paradigm is applied to the artifact, they become mnemonics of history, metonyms of cultures and archaeological sites. And this can be a very big problem when the museum represents living people. In 2018, I stood in the special exhibition of the Bodice Shoe Museum in Toronto alongside a group of Inuit art leaders as a part of a grant project. We followed the guide in respectful silence for 20 minutes as she lectured these women about their own culture. She spoke with such assurance, such certainty that this was the way the Arctic peoples did it. And after we left, the women turned to me and asked what I thought of the exhibit as the only Chalanat, Anananak. And as I told them, it was like the curator completely forgot that they still existed, that they thought they lived in igloos. Mila Vinci Carpio recounted a similar encounter at the National Museum of the American Indian. Quote, "As an indigenous visitor to the museum, I also found that I became part of the spectacle. Since I possessed the phenotypical characteristics of an Indian, black hair, dark skin, many visitors halted their conversation when I walked into the exhibit areas, or interrupted their conversation until they walked past me. I witnessed these reactions several times. It was as if my humanity disrupted their ability to observe indigenous life and culture from a distance." End quote. So I am led to ask, what are we to say in art history or in history when the past has yet to really leave the past or the present? History is not just one event after another, nor is it a foreign country. From a holistic framework, history is a cumulative affair, rather more like an ocean wave where actions and encounters build upon each other. The past informs the present so that it is co-present with it. And presenting museum collections to illustrate a cumulative concept of time and history breaks down the inherently problematic ideologies embodied in strict linear history narratives. As Handler notes that, quote, representatives of those cultures we call traditional do not necessarily view culture change as evidence of decay or death, end quote. Traditions are passed down over time, taking new forms and new meanings that build upon the blocks that came before. Instead, these displayed objects are embedded within a network of relationships between times and actors that can reveal deeper understandings of culture and history. So there's been a shift in the priority for museological function in recent decades, from authoritative preservation to community relevance. The importance of this shift highlights that, anthropologically, the museum has always been a social institution, as well as functioning as a repository of objects. These are places where ideas about art, power, community, race, identity, politics, music, nationalism, and citizenry can be discussed, contested, created. And through this, the public builds new relationships with the museum and its collections that can produce new ways of thinking, new ways of living. A sense of continuity and connectivity is created through the process of memory making that arises from active engagement with objects of material culture. And as the very purpose of the museum is to transfer knowledge, to survive, collections are meant to be used. Krebs explains that, quote, objects stand for significant traditions, ideas, customs, social relations, and it is the stories they tell, the performances they are a part of, and the relationships among people and between people and places that are more important than the objects themselves, end quote. Thus, viewing, while standard and very much an accepted practice, does not necessarily engage the viewer with objects in a meaningful way, because the physical and contextual isolation is still there. And because some knowledge may be concrete, that doesn't mean it necessarily leaves a physical trace. In the simplest terms, reanimating this intangible heritage means using the objects within the collection as they were originally intended to be, or within a practice to highlight the cumulative transformations that it passed through to the present. Because heritage is not solely what is past, but what is kept, practiced, and passed on. And finally, we need to address the intangible aspects of the collection. In the words of Sean Wilson, a noted indigenous scholar, quote, rather than viewing ourselves as being in relationship with other people or things, we are the relationships that we hold and are a part of, end quote. I want to focus on this because the relationships themselves, those things that can't be touched, can't be cataloged, are still a part of those collections because they give the collections meaning. Such products cannot be defined or conserved, preserved in a strict sense because it's an intangible action that is always changing with each encounter. So, to conclude, taking together the acknowledgement of an object's agency and relational interaction, the ongoing cumulative growth of meaning and function over time, and the inalienable necessity of historical and cultural context, we are left with the conclusion that these objects, the museum collection, is essentially a living entity. That is to say, these objects served a purpose, and they still do. As a part of those networks, collections require interaction in order to maintain their function and meaning. They are participants, and by reframing how we and the institution interact with these collections, we create new meaning. We are the stories we tell, and this is a story I tell, as Hawaiian scholar Cashman notes. Museums are institutions where the stories of history, of identity, of resistance and existence are told. The museum collection itself is alive and is telling us a story. Are you listening to what it has to teach? Thank you.